The world's poorest countries. A dozen glaring poverty. Should I have lunch today? How to live on $1 a day? Will I ever be able to buy new clothes for myself? These wild questions are asked daily by about 10% of the world's population. In 1971, for the first time, a list of 24 countries with GDP per capita below $750 was compiled. Later, the list was replenished, and at the moment there are 48 states in it. Only 10 of them were able to avoid the status of the third world over the years. In order for a country to be excluded from the list, its GDP per capita must be at least $150 higher than the original $750. Geographically, the poorest countries in the world are located at the equator and in tropical latitudes, which is easy to explain, because it is here that the highest population density is. Democratic Republic of the Congo. GDP per capita. $216. The reason for Congo's poverty is the civil war that began in the mid-1990s and lasted for about 8 years. Over the years, the country's economy has been completely destroyed. A humanitarian catastrophe has loomed over the country. The result is total poverty and the lowest GDP per capita in the world, although the country's territory is very rich in resources. The Congo is often called a failed state. Burundi. GDP per capita. $389. Almost all residents of the country work in agriculture, and most of them live far below the poverty line. Cows and goats hardly carry milk here, the land is not fertile, there is no work, and Europeans certainly have nothing to do, so there is no question of tourism that could raise the economic situation. The population survives thanks to exports, though it is unclear what. Central African Republic. GDP per capita. $391. The current poverty of the republic is largely the result of the civil war. There are many useful resources in this country: oil, uranium, gold, diamonds, but it does not help the life of the population in any way, and the economy is not developing at all. Unfortunately, this is a typical African story. Niger. GDP per capita. $381. There is no civil war in Niger, but in 25 years there have been several military coups, as many as 6 republics have been replaced. Citizens engaged in the redistribution of power lost control over the economy, although they had the opportunity and the necessary resources. About 90% of the population is engaged in agriculture, which is completely dependent on precipitation, as droughts are frequent due to the hot climate. Liberia. GDP per capita. $500. Liberia was founded in the 19th century by black slaves freed from the United States, but today 95% of the country's population are representatives of local tribes. For many years, the country has been beset by a series of civil wars that have completely destroyed the economy. Although many vessels now fly the Liberian flag, each of which pays the country a fee, this is still not enough to maintain an acceptable standard of living in the country. Exports of lumber, rubber and ore also failed to cover the impressive budget deficit. Zimbabwe. GDP per capita. $589. The failed land reform of 2000 left Zimbabwe in a disastrous situation. In just 10 years, the country turned from a leader in Africa into a lagging neighbor. Unemployment now stands at almost 100%, and the few citizens who are still registered as working are engaged in agriculture, mainly growing wheat. The majority of the population has a low level of education and lives mainly in large families. Somalia. GDP per capita. About $600. It is almost impossible to calculate GDP, and in general, it is difficult to assess the economic indicators of a completely ruined country, but experts tried, and suddenly Somalia turned out to be far from the poorest country in Africa. According to the Central Bank of Somalia, the country maintains a healthy informal economy dominated by livestock, telecommunications and money transfer companies. Afghanistan. GDP per capita. $687. Afghanistan has been in a state of civil war since the 1980s. The Afghans have failed to build a normal state because the majority of the population either holds machine guns in their hands or grows drugs. At the moment, drugs are the basis of Afghanistan's shadow economy. It is estimated that the cultivation and sale of opium and its derivatives account for 15% of the total GDP. Well, keep in mind that Afghanistan until recently had limited trade relations with other countries. Ethiopia. GDP per capita. $483. One of the largest and oldest countries in Africa is trying to make a living from agriculture, but almost 40% of Ethiopians live below the poverty line. This situation caused Ethiopia to plunge into civil war. In addition, the separation of Eritrea from Ethiopia in 1993 cut off access to the sea for former compatriots, which significantly hindered and slowed down development. The country periodically tries to improve the situation with reforms, but the famine has not gone anywhere. Eritrea. GDP per capita. $747. Eritreans hoped for a rapid recovery, but the situation in the country did not improve after the separation from Ethiopia in 1993. On the contrary, the country retains access to the sea, but breaks the established logistical and economic ties with its neighbors. The 1998 war with Ethiopia worsened the situation. Now Eritrea is a very poor country, exhausted by a long war with its neighbors. The command economy of the country is poorly structured, and 80% of citizens are engaged in agriculture.